Okay, well, I want to welcome everybody to the Parrot Club. It's February 9th, and I'm very pleased to have Tanya Martínez talking to us. Tanya is a conservation biologist who's the project leader for the Puerto Rican Parrot Recovery Project, run by the Puerto Rico Department of Natural and Environmental Resources. And she's going to be talking to us about the status of the project and very excitingly about the vocalizations they make, which is an area of particular interest to me, and sorts of things like what happens if you're raising baby parrots with a similar species and they learn other dialects or languages, and then you have to release them back into the original population. So very interesting issue I'd never heard of until I heard her talk for World Parrot Trust about this. So without any further ado, Tanya, the floor is yours. And I'm going to mute everybody.
Okay. Thank you so much, Amy. Can you enable...
Whoops, just 1 second. I need to unmute you. Yes, unmute. There we go.
Okay. Can you enable screen sharing? It says you have a host disabled screen sharing.
Ah.
These Zoom meetings, always something.
Okay, try it now.
All right. Okay, great. Perfect. Okay, great. Let's, are we on the PowerPoint screen? Can you guys see it?
Yes.
Great. Please let me know if it ever seems like I'm talking about a slide that isn't showing to you guys, or if my connection starts getting choppy. Then I'll slow it down, or I'll turn off the video feed. And then also this presentation has a lot of audio in it because like Amy said, it's basically about parrot calls. So make sure you have your audio turned up, because I think some of the videos might have a lower sound volume. So if you can turn that up whenever I start playing a sound, that way you'll be sure not to miss anything. So this talk is basically about this research on parrot vocalizations that I did during my master's studies. And it's about the evolution of Puerto Rican parrot calls and the way that this conservation program really changed the way that these parrots sound, and in a really unexpected way. And so we're going to give you a little bit of an intro to the Puerto Rican Parrot Recovery Program, and then I'll go ahead and talk about the study. So for those of you who have never seen this bird, this is the Puerto Rican parrot. It's one of the smaller Amazon species. It's found only on the island of Puerto Rico, and it is critically endangered. So if you've never been to Puerto Rico, that's right here in the Caribbean. Hopefully, once the pandemic gets a little more under control, if you haven't gotten a chance to come, I do recommend that you give us a visit. It's a beautiful place, and you can see Puerto Rican, Amazon Puerto Rican parrot, and you can't see it anywhere else in the world. So the Puerto Rican Parrot Conservation Program is a recovery program that's run by 3 different government agencies, being the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Puerto Rico Department of Natural and Environmental Resources, that's the agency that I work for, and the U.S. Forest Service. And together, they created this program, which started almost back in the, well, not almost back, it started back in the 70s, and then eventually different partners got involved, and then it became what it is today, where we have these 3 government agencies working together to have what is essentially a captive breeding and release program. And so this is a short video that I'm going to play for you guys from our most recent release. This was 2020 release. That's James Gilardi from the World Parrot Trust opening the release cage. And this is one of our Amazon parrot release cages. The birds are all in there. The cage door gets opened up early in the AM. And you'll be able to get a chance to see them. There's one of them flying over to the side of the cage. And just sort of staring and wondering what he's going to do with that. Ah, there goes one. And then this one, look, oh, he's going to go.
Oh, this one.
And the one behind him just sort of stares at the hole and says, I'm not so sure. But these are what these guys look like. With bright blue feathers on their primary flight feathers. But they are mostly green and just a little red at the top, white circle around the eye. And that antenna that you see is from the radio collar that the parrot is wearing. And then this is a parrot on one of our feeding stations. So once the parrots are released into the wild, we do a soft release so the birds have access to food all year round in case they have trouble finding food in the wild. And so groups of parrots will arrive at the feeding stations. And then this is a mother parrot and her chick. So you can see that the birds are breeding in the wild. We have a wild female and the bird that's bobbing its head next to her. That's the baby who's begging for food from his mom. So it's been a tremendous success. We have great success with the releases. We have breeding in the wild, and the birds have been doing very, very well. Okay, so that should be the end of the video. Just a super brief introduction. This is a graph that I put together of basically what the Puerto Rican parrot population has done over time. It's on a logarithmic scale, and then on the y-axis you have the number of parrots, on the x-axis you have the year, and then the two different colors correspond to either the captive or the wild population. So in captivity, you can see how the population has changed and been increasing over time, and then in the wild, you can see how the population had this drastic decline from the 1940s to about the 1970s, when the conservation program really took off, and the captive population was founded. And then after that, you can see that the population has had ups and downs over the years because the conservation programs aren't perfect, and it really has taken a lot of research, a lot of effort to really get these populations off the ground. And then if you take a look over here at 2017, you'll see a huge decline in wild population numbers, and that corresponds to, of course, Hurricane Maria and the very devastating effects that it had on this wild population. But then if you take a look at 2020, where you can see that the wild population numbers have pretty much rebounded since Hurricane Maria, and right now we're up to these very record numbers in the wild, over 140 to 150 parrots just in the Rio Abajo forest alone, and additional efforts to reintroduce parrots into some of our other forests. And I'll tell you a little bit about that during our presentation. So this is just sort of a timeline. You can see like what the species has really been through and what the conservation program has done for it. So we keep talking about what exactly it is that this conservation program does. So like I mentioned at the beginning, this is a captive breeding program. We started with these 13 birds that were in the wild in the 1970s, and every other parrot is descended from these small number of founders that were brought into captivity at different points in time. And captive breeding, it's an essential tool, especially for species like this, species that are really on the brink, that it's really just kind of a last resort. It's not really something that you do, it's not your first resort for conservation. Ideally, when you're conserving a species, you want to get into protection of habitat and use other strategies. But when you get down to this point, there's really nothing else to be done except breeding in captivity. Because when you have just 13 birds in the wild, you're really you're going to lose the species in the blink of an eye. And that's why this conservation program was founded. However, captive breeding isn't perfect. Captive breeding has a lot of limitations. Among them, it's the fact that captive breeding can lead to changes in behavior with animals that are bred in captivity. In particular, because animals that are bred in captivity often lack the opportunity to interact with wild animals. Just to give one of the more famous examples, these are whooping cranes, another famous endangered species. And some of the behaviors that are more likely to change in captivity are these what are known as cultural behaviors. And cultural behaviors are behaviors that are learned from other conspecifics. So it's another member of your species that teaches you this behavior. It's not necessarily a behavior that you're born with. It's not innate. It's something that you have to learn. So for instance, whooping cranes, they're migratory birds. And one of the more famous examples of loss of a cultural behavior in captivity is the loss of whooping crane migration, where these birds, they learned their migration routes by following other birds. And conservation practitioners for this species have had to use these fixed wing airplanes to teach the bird the migration routes in order for them to survive. So these cultural behaviors, once they get lost in captivity, you reach a point where you have to intervene pretty heavily to try and bring these behaviors back. And you can imagine this can have all sorts of negative consequences for a captive breeding program. But I'm not talking about migration in this parrot because the Puerto Rican parrot doesn't migrate. Instead, I'm going to be talking about Puerto Rican parrot vocal behavior. And since you guys are all parrot owners, I'm sure you know a lot about parrot vocal behavior on your personal day-to-day lives. So as you can imagine, parrots use vocal behavior primarily for communication, especially these very cryptic birds like Puerto Rican Amazons. The birds are green, they've got a little bit of red, a little bit of blue, but mostly the bird is just green. And so for parrots to find each other in these green forests, they rely very heavily on their vocal communication. So 50 points to anybody who can find the Puerto Rican parrot that's hidden in this image. And I'm going to assume this is kind of a difficult challenge for some of you. So let me know at the end of the talk how many of you were able to actually find the bird by the time that I finish talking. All right, so time's up. If you haven't found the bird, it is right there. So yeah, as you can imagine, green bird, green background, they've really got to depend on sound rather than sight to communicate with one another, especially when they're separated physically. And this is very common for parrots. Parrots depend on their vocalizations. And we know from studies with other species that vocalizations are used for a lot of things. For instance, in studies with these green rump parrotlets, we know that green rump parrotlets and many other species of parrots use vocalizations for individual recognition. They can distinguish between males and females. They can distinguish between mates and non-mates, and they can distinguish between offspring and non-offspring. With brown-throated conures, another study found that vocalizations were used to determine group membership. And parrots exists in the wild in what is essentially called a fission fusion society, meaning fission, separation, fusion, bringing together. So they form these big social groups. They form these big flocks in the wild. But the membership of these flocks is unstable. It's not always the same group of birds. So birds, they'll come together in a flock and they might flock together to find resources, but they'll also, different members of the flock will also separate and go their own separate ways. And then at different times of the day, they might come together again. And so they're always separating and coming together. And one of the ways that they're able to join these different flocks is with their vocalizations. These studies on brown-throated conures found that flocks of conures will forage and then they'll call out to overflying flocks. And birds that are, if a bird is called out to by a foraging flock, then they're more likely to join that flock. And if a bird does not call out to a flock, then they don't necessarily join that flock. So vocalizations might govern the way that groups are formed in wild birds. And then this one of the most famous examples, which I'm sure you guys will be hearing about with Irene Pepperberg, There's vocal imitation. Anyone who owns an African gray knows this incredibly well. They're incredibly good imitators. And the reasons that parrots are vocal imitators is because they imitation affects a lot of how they interact with each other in the wild. We know from studies that parrots can imitate the calls of other parrots in order to gain group membership, in order to solicit the attention of a particular individual. We know that mated birds tend to develop vocalizations that are more similar to each other. So imitation is a big part of how parrots use their vocalizations. And that leads to this phenomenon of what I'm going to be talking about today, which is vocal dialects. And the best way to explain vocal dialects in birds is sort of to go back and explain them in humans. It's not a perfect analogy, but it'll help you get the idea. So this is a study by NC State University. They were looking at human dialects. So you guys have probably heard of dialects. People in different parts of the country have different words for the same thing. For instance, this is a map of what is your generic term for a sweetened carbonated beverage. And depending on where you live in the country, you have a different word for this, be it soda, which is red. So the coasts are more likely to say soda. In the north, they're more likely to say pop. And then in the south, they're more likely to say Coke. And then another example, what word do you use to address a group of 2 or more people? Be it you guys, you, y'all, and you all. And then US is pretty much split north to south between you guys and y'all. And that's one of the funnier words that I learned when I learned the English language. To me, you know, in Puerto Rico, we're just pretty much taught you guys. So I think we're taught most of a kind of a northern dialect when we learn English in Puerto Rico. So it's really not until you interact with people from the South that you start hearing the word y'all. And that is just this whole other thing. Same thing goes for pop. I did not know that Americans called soda pop until I went to Michigan and there was a sign that said recycle your pop cans. And I was like, what are these people talking about? And I needed a translation because, you know, I'm from Puerto Rico, but, you know, I did learn English, but apparently I had always learned soda. So this is just one of the ways that language sort of takes these interesting turns and what is comparable to the way that birds use vocalizations is that humans learn their language. They're not born with it. They have to be taught language. And because they have to be taught language, this paves the way for all sorts of innovation to creep into the language. And that is why you get these different interpretations of words, and you might have 2 different words for the same thing, or lots of different words for the same thing, and that's going to be regionally distributed. So in Puerto Rico, we have a really great fun example, and I made this little GIF based on that. And it's this delicious pastry. It's a pastry with filling, and if you've never had one, I really recommend you have one when you come visit us here in Puerto Rico. And depending on where you are in Puerto Rico, you're either going to refer to this pastry as an empanadilla, or you're going to call it a pastelillo. And people get into all sorts of fights about why it's called empanadilla or pastelillo, and where and under what context it should be called each. We can agree that it is delicious. The parrots don't eat this pastry, as fun as that GIF was to make. But dialects in birds, what it actually means is that a bird of the same species in location A and a bird of the same species in location B might produce a vocalization under the same context, but the bird in location A under this context is going to sound different than the bird in location B. And so this phenomenon of vocal dialects, it's actually only found in 3 groups of birds. So we have passerines, songbirds, hummingbirds, and parrots. And what makes these birds unique, what makes it so that they have these vocal dialects, it's because all of these groups of birds are vocal learners. They're not born with these vocalizations. They have to learn their vocalizations as they grow up, and they learn them from imitating other conspecifics, be it parents or other birds in their society. They eventually have to learn these vocalizations. So in parrots, one of the best study systems for this dialect formation was in the yellow-naped Amazons in Costa Rica. So Dr. Tim Wright of New Mexico State University did this a series of really great studies on these birds, and they found basically 3 different dialects for the birds that they sampled. I'm going to play some examples of them now. So this is where you want to turn your audio up. So they had a Nicaraguan dialect for the birds that were closer to the border of Nicaragua. It sounded like this. And then they had a northern dialect. These are the, sorry, let me explain this little map. The circles with the numbers, these are the different roosts. So they actually went to these birds' roosting sites, and then they recorded them, and then they plotted them on a map. And, you know, so you can, this is basically like that map I showed you guys of where in the US they say Coke and where in the US they say soda. So imagine this is, you know, Coke and soda and pop. So, you know, this would be Coke and this would be pop and this would be soda. All right, so the northern dialect, which are these little blue ones, sounded like this. And then they had a southern dialect, which are here these red, the roosts that are highlighted with red squares. And then they also had this really interesting thing going on in their system where they had birds in between the 2 dialect regions, and they actually had kind of a hybrid of the northern and the southern dialect. This is what that sounded like. So that's really interesting. So this is something that you know, we knew going into the study. We know that parrots have dialects. It's been well documented in this group of birds. But what I wanted to know was, do Puerto Rican Amazons have dialects? And at the time that the study was going on, you know, this question hadn't been answered. Because what if Puerto Rican parrots had these dialects, had developed these dialects over time? How would that impact a conservation program? So, for instance, we know that vocalizations are really important in finding your mate and identifying your mate. So, you know, maybe if birds had different dialects in different populations, that could affect the outcome of mating or the success of finding a mate. We know about those foraging studies. So would it affect the bird's ability to socialize with other birds and be able to join these foraging groups? And then what about survival? We have these birds that we raise in captivity and then release into the wild. So if birds had different dialects, would that affect their ability to survive? So those are some of the reasons we might want to know if parrots have different dialects. At the end of the day, my study didn't measure these specific consequences, but it did ask this question. So a little introduction as to why Puerto Rican parrots might have developed a dialect. We know that dialects form basically when populations are separated from one another, because birds are going to learn their dialects from other birds within that population. So if you separate birds into different geographic populations, you create conditions for dialects to form. And that's exactly what happened with the Puerto Rican parrot. You see, before colonization of Puerto Rico, this is my historical map, Puerto Rican parrots used to be distributed all over the island. And by the 1940s, Puerto Rican parrots could only be found in this small area of what would eventually be called the Eljunke National Forest. Then by the 1970s, we founded the first captive population in that same forest, which is when there were only 13 birds left in the wild. But of course, it's never a good idea for a conservation program to put all your eggs in one basket. So almost literally in this sense, birds were translocated to a second population in the Rio Abajo State Forest, which is where I work. And the purpose of this was to make sure that you had a geographically separated population so that in the event of a disease outbreak or a hurricane or some other type of catastrophe, if anything happened to one of the populations, you would still have a second population that would safeguard some of the birds. Then in 2006, population numbers had increased enough that we could actually begin reintroducing birds into the wild in Rio Abajo State Forest, and that's what we did. So this was the distribution of parrots at the time that I began this study. So there were 2 wild populations and 2 captive populations. And in order to determine if these birds actually had vocal dialects, what we had to do was record birds from all of the populations, put a sample of birds and compare them across populations, and then find out whether or not the calls were different. So this is how it was done. Basically, I had a directional microphone, which is that long stick I have in my hand, and a spotting scope, which is what I'm using to find birds. And then the directional microphone, you point it at the bird, and it amplifies sound from the direction that it's being pointed at. So ideally, you'll get mostly just the vocalizations from the bird that you're pointing the microphone at. And then to understand a little bit about how we analyze and how we study sounds, I'm gonna take you guys into the wonderful world of spectrograms. So I'm gonna be showing you what that looks like. So I'm gonna get out of this presentation really quick. Hoping everybody is still there. Is everybody still there, Amy?
We're here.
Okay, great. All right, so you can get to the Chrome Music Lab. Just Google Spectrogram and eventually you get to this page. And this is an online spectrogram maker. And a spectrogram is basically a picture of sound. And I'm going to show you a little bit of what spectrograms look like. So you can come here and play with these buttons sometime. It's a lot of fun. But basically this black screen here generates a spectrogram. So spectrogram is essentially a graph. It's got time on the x-axis and it's got frequency on the y-axis. So for instance, if we hold this down here, that's a sound. And I held it down for a long time, so that made a long sound. So that had that you can tell that was active for, that was a sound that was on for more time. Whereas if I just do a short sound, so a short musical note, and that's at a pretty low frequency. Let's bring this high, because I said that on the y-axis you have frequency. So the higher you go, the higher the frequency. So frequency, higher frequencies in the human ear, we interpret them as a higher pitch, and lower frequencies, we interpret them as lower, harsher sound. Now, obviously, the human voice or bird song is a lot more complex than just a few notes. You can also play this little example here of a bird. Not sure what bird this is, but it'll actually show you a bird. So you can see that frequency and just the vocalization in general of this bird, something that's a lot more complex. It's, there's a lot more information here, a lot of going on in these images. So how do you even measure something like that? Let's say you record it and you've got sound that something like this. Well, what do you do with it then? Well, you take it, there's a number of different programs that can be used to analyze sound. So the ones that we used is this program called Lucinia. And then this, what we have here, hoping you guys are seeing it. Are you guys, this should tell me what screen is active.
We see it.
Okay, great. So this is the Lucinia interface. And then what we have here is a parrot call. So let's go ahead and play it. So yeah, so that's what one of the parrots sounds like. And then Lucinia allows us to take this cursor and highlight it. And then it actually highlights the sound, and it'll let you separate the sound from whatever background noise you have going on here. And then once you highlight this image, you can see, it tells you over here, you can see what frequency this is, what the duration of the sound is, and it also measures some other parameters. I'm not going to get into, but basically, you know, you can highlight the sound, you can see the sound, and then you can take mathematical measurements on it. And when you have math, when you have numbers, you can make comparisons between different sounds. So back to the presentation, that was your 5-minute introduction to spectrograms. I hope you guys found it fulfilling. Okay, so once again, these are the study populations. The wild Eljunke population, which at the time of the study, unfortunately numbered only between 9 to 11 parrots. The captive population in Eljunke, which had about 200 parrots in captivity then, and the captive population in Rio Abajo, where we had also around 200 parrots. The wild population in Rio Abajo that at that time had about 80 to 90 parrots in it. And then populations, they do interact, but they don't interact of their own accord, because Eljunke forest and Rio Abajo forest are too far away from each other for parrots to fly between one forest and another. But both captive populations exchange birds between the two aviary facilities for purposes of just management and genetic improvement and those sorts of things. And then each population also releases birds into the wild. So birds go from captive population to captive population. They also go from captivity to wild. And then we recorded birds that were both residents, so born and raised in that facility, and birds that were translocated between facilities. So we recorded 6 of the 9 to 11 birds that were in Eljunke at the time, 37 in the captive Eljunke population, 37 in the captive Rio Abajo population, and 29 in the wild Rio Abajo population. And then we also recorded birds that had been translocated from one facility to another, from Eljunke to Rio Abajo, because we also wanted to see whether or not birds that were transferred between facilities would change dialects. So we recorded 11 of these birds. And so we took a look at 2 types of calls that birds made. You know, you guys are parrot owners, so I'm sure you know that parrots, they make all sorts of sounds and under lots of different contexts, and they could have a call for everything. And Puerto Rican parrots, their sound repertoire was really quite expansive. So we had to select some sounds that were common and easy to record, and the birds produced frequently. And then we take a look at these 2 calls that the birds produce a lot, and they were called the caw call and the chi call. Well, they weren't called that, we called them that. And it's a, you know, somewhat onomatopoeic. You can argue whether or not it actually says caw or chi. But this is what a caw call sounds like. I'll play it for you. So that's a caw call, and this is what we called a chi call, for lack of any other, you know, name. Okay. And what was interesting about these calls is that the caw call, the birds in the wild Rio Abajo population, the birds in the captive Rio Abajo population, and the birds in the captive Eljunke population would produce these calls. But the chi calls were only produced by birds in captivity. And if you notice, there's one population that I didn't put on this little diagram, and that's the wild Eljunke population. And that is because they produce neither the caw or the chi call. So what's going on there? The wild birds in Eljunke, they were the founding population. They were the very first, basically where the project took off from. So we know that we had birds in Eljunke when the birds were basically restricted, extirpated from their range in the rest of the island. And they were only, they were basically just stuck in the small area in Eljunke since the 1940s, and then by the 1970s, when the when the captive population was founded, they were down to their really, really low numbers. And the birds in the Eljunke wild population, they were, you could say they were the original vocalizations. This is what the Puerto Rican parrots sounded like before all the captive breeding program and all the population movement started. And they sounded really, really different. So I'm going to play those sounds for you. Yeah, so that sounds very different from those other sounds that I've been playing for you. And they also look very different. If you compare these spectrograms, remember spectrograms are pictures of sound. So the pictures of what these birds sound like are very different from the pictures that the other birds sound like. And so if you just want to compare what those wild birds in the Eljunke population sound like, here are some captive birds in the Eljunke population. Now listen to them. Nope, no, I muted it. All right, so that's just a short example. And then you can take a look at what these different spectrograms for the caw calls sound like in the different populations. Here, these two at the top, those are birds in the Eljunke captive facility. Those are caw calls for the birds in the Eljunke captive facility. Down below, C and D, those are birds in the captive Rio Abajo facility. And then E and F are caw calls from birds in the Rio Abajo wild population. And then at the bottom, you have captive birds producing chi calls, G and H, that's in the Eljunke captive population, and I and J are captive birds in the Rio Abajo population. And hopefully you can just see, like, even if you haven't been able to listen very closely to what these sounds sound like, you can actually just see how different the sounds are between one population and another. So the other thing we were also able to is this change in dialect over time. So for instance, you take a bird from Eljunke population, from the captive facility there, from one captive aviary on one part of the sound like that, you translocate it to the Rio Abajo aviary, ends up sounding like that, and then eventually you release it into the wild, and it ends up sounding like that. And hopefully you can appreciate just how different this evolution is between calls. So you can take these are vocalizations all from the same bird. So it was recorded in the captive facility in Eljunke, the captive facility in Rio Abajo, and then eventually the captive facility the wild population in Rio Abajo forest. And you can see just how much that call changed over time. So after this analysis, we were able to say that we were able to answer this question: do Puerto Rican Amazons have dialects? And the answer is a resounding yes. So starting with the wild Eljunke population, let's talk a little bit about how it was that these dialects may have formed. So the wild Eljunke dialect. So the most drastically different dialect of them all sounds like that, a completely different call. And it's a call it's a series of calls that none of the other parrots make. And they did not produce those caw or chi calls that we were measuring in all of these other birds. And so remember, they were the original population. So if they were the original population, how did the other parrots come to sound so differently from them? Then the captive Eljunke population. So you have to take a look at basically where that captive Eljunke population came from. And how it started was through the harvesting of eggs and chicks from the wild. So basically you had these naive founders. This is actually a picture of the first chick bred in captivity. But they had a lot of trouble back in the 1970s. There were very few number of wild birds, so they didn't want to capture them all. And they were also not very successful at capturing wild adults. There were few of them. They were just hard to get at, hard to locate, and hard to bring into captivity. So in order to found this captive population, they didn't do it with a majority of wild birds. They captured a very small number of wild birds. And most of the other founders of this population were brought in as a combination of, they were brought in as either chicks from active nests in the wild or eggs from nests in the wild. And, little by little, they started founding this captive population by harvesting eggs and chicks. So you essentially had these birds that didn't have a lot of opportunity to interact with this relict wild population, because there weren't a lot of them, and they were brought in at an age where these birds don't have their learned vocalizations or eggs that are brought in, and they don't have this exposure to their parents. So they have very limited exposure to these adult birds that are going to teach them their normal vocalizations. Also, because there were so few birds at that time, and because of the location of the captive breeding facility in relation to the wild facility, they were about 1.6 kilometers apart from each other. So that's not a huge distance for a parrot, but it wasn't regular interaction. And even if it was, there was just very few of these learning models. So you have these young chicks with very limited exposure to adult learning models. So if the wild population was so small and relatively distant, then who were these young chicks that were being raised in captivity? Who were the models for their vocalizations? Well, the Puerto Rican parrot program actually started relying on Hispaniolan Amazons, this other closely related species, and they actually came in. There was a lot of pet trade with the Dominican Republic, and these birds had been brought in and confiscated through illegal pet trade, and they were being kept at U.S. APHIS facilities in Puerto Rico. And then through talks with the government, they were able to arrange for a lot of these previously confiscated birds to be brought into the captive breeding facility. And then they had these adult birds of another species rearing these young chicks, and this cut down a lot of the hand rearing that was going on at the time, and they would have these birds incubating Puerto Rican parrot eggs. So you essentially had this whole other species raising Puerto Rican parrot chicks. So unfortunately, this is just a hypothesis that I can't test. This is what I posit as what I believe caused the initial change in the dialects, but it's not testable because all of these birds are dead. So, this happened in the 70s, it happened a long time ago. So the ideal thing would have been to be able to record one of these ancient Hispaniolan Amazons and see, what do these birds sound like, and did every other parrot population, Puerto Rican parrot population, really sound like what these birds sounded like at that moment. We don't know that because those birds aren't around to record and to test. But I was able to record Hispaniolan Amazons in Rio Abajo because they're at the time of the study, we did keep a small population of Hispaniolan Amazons at the Rio Abajo captive facility because some of those birds are still used for fostering. It's a practice that has decreased over time, but especially with the Puerto Rican parrots population increase. But there are still some Hispaniolan Amazons that are used to rear Puerto Rican parrot chicks. And if you listen to the vocalizations produced by those Amazons, they are indeed very similar to what the Puerto Rican Amazons in Rio Abajo sound like. So I'm just going to play one for you now. So this is what a call sounds like from a Puerto Rican Amazon. This is Puerto Rican Amazon here at the top. So I'm going to play that. And now listen to what an Hispaniolan Amazon sounds like. So it's a pretty similar call. And you can see the structure in the spectrogram visually. It's also very similar. It's got like this long syllable at the front and then these three shorter syllables. Same thing goes for these cheek calls. So this is the Puerto Rican parrot here at the top. And then this down here is going to be the Hispaniolan Amazon. So as you can see, it's possible to have these two different species acquire or develop very similar calls. Now, in this case, we don't know who learned these vocalizations from who, because these birds are being housed in the same facilities over a number of years. But we know that these Hispaniolan Amazons are part of the fostering program to this day in Rio Abajo. So it's possible that these vocalizations could have been learned from these foster parents, either at this point or some other point in the program's history. So heading over to the Rio Abajo captive facility, the second captive population, that they did have adult learning models when those birds were being raised, because the second population was founded by transferring adult birds from the Eljunke population to the Rio Abajo facility. So those chicks being produced at this new aviary were definitely learning their vocalizations from adult parrots. So why would we see a change here in this population? Well, we can see it because of a phenomena called cultural drift. And basically, these are small innovations that occur because the learning process is imperfect. And so when you have groups of birds learning vocalizations and imitating other birds, learning is imperfect. So you're going to have variation as the vocalization is transmitted from one individual to another. And you combine that with the fact that these birds are separated geographically from the founding population, that variation is going to accumulate over time. And then eventually you're going to have different vocalizations. So for instance, I'm not sure where the audio went there. Yeah, sorry about that. It should have played an audio, but you can see the difference between the Rio Abajo captive population and the Eljunke captive vocalization at the bottom. All right, so what about the Rio Abajo wild population? And one of the more interesting things about this population is they eliminated a call. They did not produce this cheek call. You could only hear a cheek call in recently released wild birds, but anything that was born in the wild or had spent some time in the wild was no longer producing these cheek calls. They were still producing the caw calls, but their caw calls were different. And what's one of the explanations for why you have this evolution in the vocalizations of the wild birds in Rio Abajo. Wild birds in Rio Abajo can basically interact with the captive birds. So they overfly the facility and they're released on site very close to the cages. So they're fully capable of interacting with these other birds. But it's probably more in their interest to interact vocally with other wild birds, because the other wild birds are the ones that tell them where the food is. You know, they're the ones that they flock with. They're the ones that they mate with, and so they're more likely to use this vocal communication, engage in vocal communication with a bird that is going to help you get resources and help you survive. So it makes sense that eventually over time, just through cultural drift, again, a vocalization would change, and then it would be maintained by this need to interact and sort of culturally merge with this other group of wild birds. So what are some of the implications of this type of study where, you know, we know that we have a captive breeding program, we know that we have separate populations, and we know that when we separate the populations, we have these different dialects. Well, unfortunately, we can't exactly measure what the specific cost or what the consequences of having the dialects would be, because ideally you would do that with an experiment. You would take some birds from one population and you would release them. You would release a group that has the dialect and a group that doesn't have the dialect, and you would measure, well, who survives more, the group that has a local dialect or the group that doesn't. And you're not going to do that with an endangered species population, because you're never going to endanger them in that matter. In that manner, so there are certain studies that you really can't measure over time. But what we do know is that birds that are translocated from one population to another, over time they will always adopt the local dialect, and they have a clear inclination to do this. And this really tells us something, that this has to have some type of biological importance. Because the birds are trying to learn these dialects. So this seems to be important to the birds. So while we can't, mathematically measure, well, how important is it? How big a deal is it? Well, we can at least create conditions that we could maximize the opportunity that the birds have to learn these new dialects. So for instance, in the future, we're going to be releasing a new wild population at this southwestern forest called the Maricao State Forest. And once those birds are they're first going to be brought into the Maricao and kept in captivity for a period of about a year while they receive flight training and foraging training, and then eventually they're going to be released. And if we take a look at what's happened in the past, then we can be pretty certain that once we reintroduce a population into the Maricao State Forest, there's a good chance that that's going to turn into another wild dialect. And so with this knowledge that we have, we know that in the future, it would be a good idea to expose parrots to these learning models, ideally as early as possible. So in this picture, we have this wild parrot, and he's on top of the release cage, and you can see the parrot inside the cage, and he's gnawing on his little transmitter antenna. And so what we're proposing is that when birds are translocated, they get translocated early, so that they get translocated young, and they have as much opportunities as possible to be exposed to these wild learning models, because we know that eventually they're going to go out into the wild and they're going to be interacting with these birds. And so it's a good idea to give them the opportunity to listen to these wild vocalizations and start practicing them and start learning them, so that once they are released, they can integrate more readily and presumably get all of these social benefits that parrots get from being able to communicate in a group. All right, so I think that's pretty much the end of this presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, be happy to answer them now. Also, just a quick plug for our social media outlets. We've got a really great Facebook page where we're constantly putting updates on the project and the different things that are going on, different activities. The breeding season is starting now, so there's going to be lots of pictures of baby parrots that I know everybody goes crazy for. And also just all of the different things that we're doing in the program. We're always talking about them. I'm also very active on Twitter, less so on Instagram, though I've been trying to maintain it a little more. But yes, if you want to keep up with us, keep up with the parrot news, please feel free to follow us on social media. If you have any specific questions, that's my official email address. So I hope you guys enjoyed that, and I'll take questions now.
That was fabulous, Tanya. Wonderful, wonderful. Oh, I should mention, by the way, you saw Iguaca in her name. That's the local name of the parrot.
Yes.
I also want to encourage everybody, if you have a few dollars you can throw their way. They always need money. They're, I think, partially funded by Fish and Wildlife, right, Tanya?
Yes.
We're
funded Fish and Wildlife grant and state funding, but all funding is appreciated. I can probably put a link to the Mighty Cause page. Probably should have done that first. But you can,
It was also an information I sent out.
Okay,
so
great.
People have that also, but I mean, just so many questions and comments. I'm surprised that drift occurs so quickly. It's pretty amazing in the space of only a few years. So you mentioned that when you release captive birds into the wild population, they try to adapt to the wild population. But what about the other way around? Because I know in Australia, when native parrots escape or are released and they know human speech, there have been many documented instances of them teaching the wild birds the human speech. So you'll have flocks of cockatoos all saying, "Who's a pretty bird?" even though most of them are wild birds. I'm just wondering if any, I don't know if you've seen that.
I have not. I think that's fascinating.
That's why I was wondering if any of the captive bred birds that say, for example, the cheek call, do they teach that to their wild compatriots?
Yeah, that's not something that we've seen in this population. In fact, so any of these sort of like artifacts of human speech, and we only see them in our population in captivity. For instance, with all of and only with hand-reared Puerto Rican Amazons. So you have Puerto Rican Amazons that are in captivity that were hand-raised. They whistle. A lot of them whistle or make a weird noise. And, and this is all, some type of artifact from being handled by humans and imitating humans. But none of the birds that were parent reared will have them, at least in our captive population. And I think Australia is a really interesting example because they have so many parrots and they live in such close proximity to humans in a lot of places. And so that doesn't surprise me, but I think it's fascinating. I hadn't heard of that. I don't know if there have been any studies on that, on exactly how that works. I mean,
I think there have. I'll take a look and I'll
please do. I'd love to take a look at that.
Yeah, and we have a couple of questions from the chat. I don't want to forget. Gayla asked, she said the captive birds sounded more scared and stressed out. Was wondering if that was the case or if it was just the dialect.
Yeah, yeah. I think they kind of got they ended up with this very. It depends on the call. Like there are some that are. The wild birds had kind of a very musical call, and then the captive birds, some of those vocalizations can be a little harsher. It depends on the population that I was recording. Also, there's some that are just sort of lower pitched, and there's a lot of variety in those vocalizations. But the birds do have a very typical stress call when you are handling them for any sort of veterinary medical procedure. And it's very different from these calls. It's a like you're killing me type of call.
I think I know that.
Probably lots of your parrots have you're killing me type of call, but it's very different from this is like they have these flowing melodious called, not really melodious. Parrot calls aren't melodious. They're not songbirds. They're ugly singers.
And Kim wants to know, how did the hurricane a few years ago affect the parrots?
Very badly. So yeah, maybe I'll just put up that. Well, no, I mean, you guys saw that graph that I showed. So 2017 was horrible. And it was bad for a lot of reasons because we had just reached these really huge peaks in the population numbers. Rio Abajo had just peaked at its all-time high. It was like over 130, all-time high at that moment. It had over 130 wild parrots. The Eljunke wild population had above 50 parrots, and we were getting ready to start the population releases in Maricao. So there was, there were all these things that were going on in 2017, and Hurricane Maria just came in like a wrecking ball. And it just absolutely decimated everything. The Eljunke population, the wild population, the original relic population, those birds that I mentioned that they sounded so different from all the other birds, they're all gone now because the hurricane pretty much it wiped out that entire population. And And they were left with something like 4 survivors initially, but those were all recently released birds, so it wasn't clear if they had any of these vocalizations. And then eventually, those birds didn't survive either. So yeah, it was. It's really sad. It's this entire lost language in a sense, because it was, as far as we know, the original vocalizations of these birds. And they're gone. They will never sound like that again. They're only going to sound like the birds that are reintroduced in captivity. The good news is that all those vocalizations are completely functional. We know that the birds are perfectly capable of communicating, of finding mates, of finding nesting areas, of finding foraging areas, and of moving as groups and as individuals with the vocalizations that they have now in the wild. And that vocalizations will always continue to evolve.
How many total birds are there now? Captivity
So if anyone want to get out a calculator, there's there's little over 200 in Rio Abajo. So I think we're at 208 right now in Rio Abajo. Eljunke, I think they're about 230, 220, something like that in captivity. In the wild, they've just started reintroducing birds into the wild in Eljunke, and they have about 20 birds now, because that whole population was wiped out. So they've only recently been able to begin their release efforts in Eljunke. So they got about 20 there, and in Rio Abajo in the wild we have about 140. So add all those up, I think it's under 6.
Less than 600 then.
Yeah.
Okay, well, question from Rebecca. I had the same question too. She says, have there been any concerns about starting a captive population from such a small founder? Has it been feasible to introduce new wild birds over the years to increase genetic diversity? Because you basically said all the birds in existence come from 13 birds.
Yes. So I didn't hear all of the question. Can you repeat?
Well, basically, is this an issue for genetic diversity to have so few founder birds?
Yeah, so I mean, it's something that you have to constantly be aware of. It's something that you have to manage for, and it's something that we do manage for. We work with the Lincoln Park Zoo, and they keep they help us keep a stud book of our population. So we have this program that they developed. It's called PopLink, and a lot of zoos and a lot of population managers use this, where basically it's a database that lets you. It's got the information of every Puerto Rican parrot that was or ever will be. Since the start of the captive breeding program. All the birds are banded. So you have all the captive birds are banded. Some birds in the wild aren't banded. But every bird has a unique ID, and they're all in this program. So this huge stud book, and you can trace the lineage of any bird in captivity back to its original founder. And then you're able to make decisions on sort of outbreeding them and breeding to maximize diversity, because of course, genetic diversity is going to be an issue when you have this very small population. Fortunately, we're not really seeing the types of problems that you would expect to see. So because in the wild in Rio Abajo, we have very high fertility, we have good hatch success, we've got good survival, and these are all indications that we're not having these huge problems with low genetic diversity. Because you would expect like very high infertility and these different sorts of problems if genetic diversity was a huge issue. That doesn't mean it's not a problem. You still have to manage for it. You still have to be very careful when you're breeding, and very careful when you're releasing birds, to make sure that the decisions that you're making are always aimed at putting the most amount of genetic diversity out there and keeping the genetic diversity in the breeding program, so that you're making sure that you're not breeding cousins and with close relatives and uncles and siblings, and so you make sure you get rid of that type of stuff. The other thing that we're getting ready to do is a genetic analysis study, where we're gonna do some sampling, some bleeding of birds in all of the populations. And based on that, we're going to be able to extract DNA, and we're going to be able to ask the question of how closely related are the birds today? Because, no matter how far back you take it, eventually there's going to be some degree of unknown in that pedigree, because the birds were wild caught at one point. And the best you can assume is that those original founders that were wild, brought in from the wild, were completely unrelated, but that probably wasn't the case. They were probably very closely related back in the 70s, because there were just 13 of them left. So we don't really know, how closely related these birds are, even when we do know their whole pedigree, because at a certain point you reach an end of the pedigree line, and you don't know who the parents were or how closely related the parents were to each other. So what we can do is sample everything now and ask the question, how closely related is everything that's alive right now?
Right. Are there any ongoing problems with poaching or further habitat destruction for these birds?
Yeah, poaching, not yet, but that's only because the species isn't abundant enough, or there's so few of them, there's not enough to poach. And the few that there are not in areas where there are people or where people can get to, and most people don't really know about them. And they're not in accessible areas. There's very few of them, and they're in inaccessible areas. As soon as they become more prevalent, or if people learn more about them, I'm sure there's going to be poaching. That's only a matter of time before poaching becomes an issue. To an extent, I've heard some people argue that they're not really that showy as birds go. They're just green with a little red. And they might not be that desirable for the pet trade. We know that they were in the pet trade before, and that was one of the things that drove them to population loss. But it's only time will tell. Will people really want to catch these when you could get a yellow nape from a pet shop and it's a much prettier bird. So there's always that.
Well, there's a lot of questions piling up here. So we have, do adult parrots have trouble learning new dialects?
Huh? I'm sorry.
Yeah, do adult parrots have trouble learning new dialects? From Gayla.
I'm guessing they're referring to sort of wild parrots. So in the wild, when we release birds from captivity into the wild, one of the things that we do is that we'll prepare them. So we'll actually go out and actually pick these wild fruits, these different plants that the birds are going to be feeding on in the wild. And they go through some pretty intensive foraging training. So they're getting these native fruits and native plants several times a week, so that they learn to recognize and they learn how to manipulate and eat these wild foods. So that is part of their training. And then birds that are hatched in captivity, I mean, they learn everything from their parents, and they do very, very well. Just within weeks of fledging from the nest, they're already eating some wild fruit, and they learn really quickly.
All right, Kim's asking, do you ban the birds along with placing the radio collars?
Yeah, so
yes, right?
Yeah, and if you take a look at our the Facebook page, we publish information on that all the time. So the radio collars, we will attach radio collars to birds that are released. So released birds get radio collars, and then also some of the chicks that fledge from wild nests, we will attach radio collars to some of those. Not every chick, but because just last year alone we fledged 44 chicks in the wild. We don't have 44 radio collars for all those chicks, but we'll usually we'll try to do one radio collar per nest. So one fledgling per nest will fly with a radio collar. And then we have a unique two-tone banding, color banding system. So we attach color bands in unique color combinations. Sorry. So we'll have these anodized aluminum bands that are both silver and yellow, or silver with yellow stripes, or red with silver stripes. And then we might have a solid color on the other leg, and you can make these individual color band combinations that we use to recite the birds. We also recapture wild birds in order to band any birds that haven't been banded, or give more unique color combinations to birds. And so we'll do a lot of that.
Great. And Gayla wants to know, what do the wild parrots eat?
Lots of stuff. So, I mean, I could, they're primarily frugivores. So there's a lot of local fruiting species. Many of which I'm going to continue plugging the social media because that's where you'll see all the pictures. And Amy specifically told me to talk about the dialects today. So I've got like whole.
I know there's like, you could talk for hours, but we have to kind of narrow it to something. So
yeah, they eat lots of local local fruits. A lot of palm fruit. They like palm fruit a lot. So the palms, different palm species will produce a fruit that they like. And
yeah, I saw that in one of the pictures. They were palm fruits.
Yeah, they got lots of fun fruits to eat, and they'll also eat some leaves, some bark. I mean, they do mostly eat the fruit, but they'll also eat munch on some other plant parts too.
Okay, and Sam wants to know, can you talk more about the data you're collecting with the transmitter tags?
Yeah, so the transmitters, so there's, obviously there's these releases each year and chick sledging each year. So we, it's more of a routine thing where we just, we track survival, so mortality, what percentage of chicks are surviving. Also movement, what areas of the forest they're hanging out to. Are they hanging out in new areas? Are they dispersing to whole other cities, which we are able to track parrots that move 20 kilometers away sometimes, and they get around sometimes, and also lots of data as to group socialization, who's hanging out with who found a pair mates, and what nests they're using, and just anything that following a bird in the forest would tell you, and what they're eating. We're able to collect all that data with the transmitters just by following them around. So birds have no privacy.
Fabulous. I love the spectrograms. That's how I actually started learning bird calls.
Oh, that's great.
Years ago, because I'm much more of a visual learner. So when I hear a call, I connect to the spectrogram, and I remember the spectrogram probably more than the call. But
that's great.
I think a lot of birders do that, people that are more into visualizations, but I just want to put a plug in for an app I absolutely love. It won't help with the Puerto Rican Amazon. I actually ran it during those calls and didn't know what it was listening to, but it's called BirdNet.
Okay.
Started by a Cornell ornithologist. And really, really simple app for your smartphone. You basically hit recording when you're hearing something outside, and then stop it, and then you just put your cursor over the area you want to identify, and it'll hopefully tell you what it is. It obviously doesn't have, I think it's mostly for the US.
So it's Shazam for birds.
It doesn't have every bird, but it's learning. So the more data there's in it, because if you identify it, it'll ask you, is that correct or not? And if you know it's correct, then you say yes. And I just love it, because I'll be just sitting here and the birds talking outside. I'm like, I hit BirdNet, spectrograms come up. I'm like, oh, that's what I've been listening to all these years. So it's really a fabulous way. I see Rebecca says, love BirdNet. I really love BirdNet. There are other apps also, but BirdNet makes it so easy to do.
That's
and
great.
you can just hit the button and it can run continuously if you in the background. And then when there's something, you can just stop it and go back to what you heard. So it's not a question of pressing start when you hear the bird. You can have it going all the time. So when I send the video information out and the information about talk and all that, I'll send a link to that too, because I highly recommend it for people. All right, do we have any more questions? You can also unmute yourself and ask. You can put it in the chat and I can say it, or you can unmute if you have any questions. I'm sure we could talk for hours about this because it's so fascinating. Seeing if anybody's unmuting themselves. All right, well, if not, I want to thank everybody for coming. I want to thank Tanya. This is such a fabulous.
I think Sam was raising his hand.
Oh, Sam, you want
All right, sorry, this is just random, but a couple of years ago, a hip hop artist from Puerto Rico named Residente.
Oh yeah.
Came to the Peabody Museum at Yale, where I was a grad student. And I just happened to be there, and I am an ornithologist, and I gave him a tour of the research collections. And it turns out he's very interested in bird songs. for some sort. Yeah, he's super interested in bird songs and interested in endemic birds special to Puerto Rico. And he asked me, like, can you show me some Puerto Rican birds? Like, are there any special Puerto Rican birds? And there was one in particular, flycatcher, that he was really interested in. I guess that has
probably the hui.
And yeah, but for some sort of project that he was thinking about or working on, it had something. He was really interested in the vocalizations in particular.
That is so cool. Are you still in contact with him?
Well, no, but what it made me think of was, like, you could, I bet he doesn't know that there's a lot of that kind of aspect related to the Puerto Rican Amazon.
Yeah, I should add him on Twitter and see if he replies.
Tweet at him.
Tweet at him and just be like, hey, man.
Yeah.
Let's have a collab.
He's super cool and nice. He's really nice. So
is he interested in sampling bird song to put in his songs?
I think so. Yeah, he's interested. It's sort of some sort of thing going. I don't know. It was very.
Hey man, whatever he wants.
Yeah,
If he's well known, he could do a song with samples from the Puerto Rican Amazon.
Yeah.
And then use that as a fundraiser.
Or just I don't know what he does. But he's a major guy in Puerto Rico.
No, he's a big deal.
Yeah,
maybe we should do some sound mixing. Like, hey, we replaced the background sound to one of your songs with Puerto Rican parrots. What do you think? I don't know. I'm like,
that's a great idea. Rebecca says he should get in touch with that woman who's been doing owl beats on Twitter. A few of you, I sent a video around recently from Twitter. I don't know if you've seen it, Tanya, by a French music group called French Fuse that sampled a cockatiel and I think it may have been a Malamute dog. And so he's playing guitar and he sampled the cockatiel tapping on a drum and calling and the dog howling and made this infectious earworm where when you sample, for those who don't know, you take a sound and then it becomes an actual musical sound and you can change the pitch, the duration, all kinds of things of the sound. And it's this infectious little tune, which may come from the Red Hot Chili Peppers based on the title. I didn't recognize it, but it's in my head constantly. So I just love things where they sample bird sounds. And Alex Lahonk, who those of you on Twitter are well aware of him, someone named Flamelog sampled a song he did and made a whole musical composition out of it. And I could just listen to it for hours. So I think it'd be really cool if somebody took all these various Amazon parrot calls and sampled them and made a song out of that too.
That would be really neat. Now I'm just thinking of like, how do I get Resiente's attention with a parrot on Twitter? This is so bad.
You and I can talk because I have a really large following on Twitter.
So do that.
So let's see.
That's what we're gonna do, Amy. We're gonna do. We're making this happening.
Well, that's fascinating. I love stuff like this. I love parrot sounds and vocalizations and all that. And it's just kind of interesting, when you talk about parrots adopting other calls. I know lots of parrots learn from other calls, and I'm probably biased because I've had cockatiels for so many years, but cockatiels are just absolute masters of learning sounds. You put one cockatiel in a room with the other one, and within a couple hours, they're doing the songs of the other one. It just kind of blows my mind how quickly they learn sounds. And I don't know if any of the other parrot species are as adept at that. Maybe they are, but cockatiels are just constantly learning sounds from each other.
Yeah.
One of my cockatiels, when he was a baby, I taught him the songs from a male cockatiel I had in the 1960s, and he learned those. And it's like he's kept those songs alive now. You talk about relic populations. And then he's taught them to other birds. So it's
that's
incredible.
Cool.
Pretty incredible.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say there's a lot of studies on convergence in captive budgies and parrotlets and stuff like that, where they talk about like how birds will converge on you know, they'll sort of make their calls more similar to each other when they're in groups, and you know, lots of things that you know, in laboratory you can do a lot with birds, and there's been a lot done. But I think like
when my parrot's outside and there's conures feeding, they go to fly off. She looks up at him and goes, "Hello." She knows who, you know, yes, you know who the green parrots are, right, Clea? Yeah. Yes, she loves everyone.
So pretty. All right, if nobody has any more questions, I'm gonna turn off the recording, which I'll do right now. You wanna stop?